Good morning.
Good morning.
Have you ever had a situation where you looked at somebody and you just kind of took them in? And you just thought to yourself, my life is never going to be the same again after this. Men, I don't know about you. I think a lot of us will see a woman and just look at her. I mean, just look how beautiful she is. Do you need a cough drop, Susan? And just say to ourselves, I'm never going to forget that face. I'm never going to get that personality. Well, I had that situation. I was a farmer. I owned fields, and things were good. And I came out to the field one morning, and there she was. Never seen her before. I knew I'd never be the same again. I noticed her right away. And this is my story. My name is Boaz. I want to tell you this morning my story. Actually, it's not my story. It's the story of my wife, Ruth. And to appropriately tell you the whole story, I need to go back and give you some history that I wasn't part of. But I heard this history many times from my wife, Ruth. You see, her mother-in-law, Naomi, was an Israelite living in Bethlehem. And there was a time when there was an unbelievable famine in the land, and they couldn't provide for themselves. Her husband's name was Elimelech, and they had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Now, oddly, their names, Mahlon and Chilion, both mean sickly, or failing, or wasting away. You might ask, why on earth would someone name their children words like sickly or wasting away? In our time, children often weren't named for months after they were born, especially because the parents wanted to make sure they were going to survive. They often weren't named until they showed some sort of distinct personality characteristics, and the parents would often give them names that had some relationship to personality characteristics they'd observed. Well, these two boys were sickly. They didn't thrive well, they didn't grow very well, they were small, and that's what their names were. Anyway, we come back to the famine. Elimelech realized he couldn't really provide for his family in Judah, so he packed everybody up. He and his wife Naomi, and the two boys, Mahlon and Chilion, and they moved to Moab. Now, I also need to tell you Naomi's name means pleasant. The name Naomi means pleasant. Elimelech means my God is king. All these names were important. But they moved to Moab. Now I need to explain something else to you about Moab. Moab would not have been in the top 50 choices for Hebrews to move to, because the Hebrews weren't friendly with the Moabites. If you don't remember, the history of Moab dates all the way back to the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Abraham bargained with God to save the city if he could find just 10 righteous people there. Well, God couldn't find 10 righteous people, it was destroyed. But Lot was offered the opportunity to escape with his wife and his two daughters. And they did, but they were warned not to look back at the city as the sulfur was raining down from the sky. Well, Lot's wife did turn around and look back, and you may remember she turned immediately into a pillar of salt. When Lot and his two daughters arrived a fair distance away from the city and set up in that area, at least temporarily, both daughters said to each other, look, there's no man around here for us to get married to. No one's going to carry on our father's family name. Let's get him drunk, and I'll sleep with him one night, and you sleep with him the next night. And we'll have sons to bear his name. It's not pretty. You can read the account for yourself in Genesis. That's what they did. The oldest one went in and lay with him the first night. The text even today tells you and me that he was utterly unaware when she got there and when she left. The younger one did the same the next night. They got him drunk. She went in, and the text says he didn't know when she came and when she left. Both of them conceived, and the oldest daughter gave birth to a son named Moab. He was the father of the Moabites. The younger one gave birth to a son named Ben-Ami, who became the father of the Ammonites. In any case, the Moabites were not considered a legitimate people because Moab was an illegitimate son, born out of incest between Lot and his oldest daughter. But I digress. That's how we get the land of Moab, and that's how we get the Moabites. That's where Naomi and Elimelech and their 2 boys moved. Well, after a while, Elimelech must not have been very healthy either because he died. Both boys married Moabite women, and they essentially had settled into Moab indefinitely. Naomi, though, was the person who maintained her connections with people. It wasn't so easy in our day. It was only done through messengers passing back and forth, and if you could get a little scrap of papyrus, you could scribble a note on it and send it on to somebody, but even that wasn't widely available. But eventually, Naomi heard from people traveling through town that the famine had come to an end. She was pleased about that. In the meantime, though, Mahlon and Chilion had both died. So now she was living only with her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth, who'd married Mahlon, and Orpah, who'd married Chilion. So all 3 of them made arrangements and packed up and got ready to return to Bethlehem, where Naomi was from, where she had community. They were completely packed. They had started down the road, and I think this overwhelming urge just, Naomi couldn't refuse. She couldn't ignore it. This overwhelming urge came to her that these 2 girls should not go with her back to Bethlehem. So she said to them, just stop, hold it. You 2 need to go back to Moab, to the families of your fathers and your mothers, to your people, because what you need is security. Now, in that day, what she was saying to them wasn't security, it was, you need a husband. Each of you needs to remarry, because a husband is security for a woman in my day. And she said, if you come with me, you're not going to find a husband because you're going to be in a foreign land, and that's not how we do things. Well, both of the women cried and wept, and they urged Naomi to let them accompany her back home. She said, no, you must go back to your home where you can find a husband. The sovereign Lord is afflicting me. He's laid this heavy burden on me. It's too much for me to bear, and you shouldn't have to bear it with me. I need to tell you something else about Naomi. Everything in her life she attributed to God. Everything. She knew of his role all the time, whether it was good news or it was bad news. Everything she knew, and she had a very close, affectionate relationship with the Lord God Almighty. Well, Orpah cried, wept, and then she did turn around and she went back. But Ruth was not to be dissuaded. And Ruth said to her mother-in-law, I'm not going to go back. Wherever you go, I'll go. Wherever you live, I'll live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And wherever you die, that's where I'll be buried. If we really just break down there what Ruth said to her, she said, I'm going to follow you as a person. I'm going to follow your place. I'm going to follow your nation, your people. I'm going to follow your God, your spirituality. And I'm going to do it for your entire life because I'll be buried wherever you're buried. Well, Naomi at some point realized she wasn't going to dissuade Ruth. It wasn't particularly good news for Naomi because she knew going back to Bethlehem, she was going to have to fend for herself. And again, it was not easy for a woman in that time. She was going to have to find a way to provide for herself, much less a young woman coming back with her. But Ruth, not to be dissuaded, they headed back. The journey was not easy because there's an elevation drop of about 4,000 feet between Moab and the mouth of the Jordan River where it empties into the Dead Sea, and then another 4,000 foot incline when you get back to Bethlehem. And it was dangerous, it was dry, it was arid. But these 2 women did make the journey back. When they got back to Bethlehem, even I heard about this, all the women that had known Naomi before looked at her and they said, can this be Naomi? It was an indication that those years she'd been gone had not been good to her. She didn't look the same. She looked like she'd aged twice as many years as she'd been gone. And she was mostly the still Naomi, but the same Naomi, but she said something really interesting. She said to them, "Don't call me Naomi," which means, remember, pleasant. She said, "Call me Mara," which means bitter. She said, "Because I left with a full family and I've returned empty-handed." I can only imagine that hurt Ruth at least a little bit. Here she has a whole person devoted to her that returned with her, but her words were, "I've returned empty-handed." But everybody understood what she was saying. She was welcomed back with open arms, and she and Ruth lived together. True to her word, Ruth studied our scriptures, and she learned that there was a provision for foreigners to go out to the field and poor people and glean. So she said to Naomi, "Let me go out and find a field to glean in, and let me find some grain for us to eat." And Naomi had decided she was good with Ruth again, and she said, "My daughter," which is a term of endearment, "please do that. Thank you." So that brings me to where I come back into the story, because that was the day she ended up in my field gleaning. I want to tell you, gleaning is hard work. It's a lot of work. It's dirty, sweaty conditions, and there's very little reward. You're looking for pieces of grain, pieces of wheat, or in this case, pieces of barley. It was the barley harvest first, that the professional gatherers have dropped, have left behind. There's not much there. You're working all day for maybe a big handful of grain if you're doing really well. So anyway, there I was. I arrived at the field, and I can only tell you, I saw her immediately. In your day and age, you have cartoons. And in the cartoon, sometimes a boy character will see the girl character and his eyes will pop out of his head. I feel like that's how I was a little bit when I saw this woman. And you have to understand, it wasn't really a romantic interest on my part, because I knew I was way too old for her. It wasn't about that. It was just someone I saw, and I saw confidence, I saw deference, I saw respect, I saw industry and hard work, I saw initiative, all in that first glance at her. I almost felt parental toward her, like I wanted to take care of her. So I stopped myself from saying anything right up front, and I first said to my men, as I always did, "Good morning, the Lord be with you." And they smiled at me as they always did, and they said, "The Lord be with you." And then I couldn't restrain myself. I said, "Who is that?" It's not exactly what I said. What I actually said was, "To whom does that young woman belong?" Because in my day, a woman belonged either to her father or to her husband. And I wanted to understand what her situation was. So I said, "To whom does that young woman belong?" But what it meant, what you would have said was, "Who is that?" Well, my supervisor told me. He said, "She's the Moabite." I thought. "Who came back from Moab." That was odd, I thought, as if I hadn't heard Moabite the first time. As if he wanted to make sure I knew she was a Moabite. Remember, we didn't get along well with them. So he says, "She's the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She asked permission to work in the field, and she's been working all day really hard, except for a short rest in the shelter." I heard about all I needed to hear in that one statement from the supervisor. She was deferential, she'd asked permission, she was a hard worker, and I could see on her face her countenance. Confidence in who she was, but not overconfidence. Confidence in her deference. I'd never seen anything like it. So I went up and I approached her. I said, "Listen, Ruth, stay in this field. You can gather grain in this field. Don't go to another field. Look at the perimeter of the edge of this field and don't go beyond the perimeter. Please follow the women who are gathering grain in this field. You can work with them. I'll tell the men to leave you alone." We all know what that means. "And also, if you get thirsty, you can drink some of the water that my men have drawn." Looking back on it, I think maybe I was a little over the top. I kind of just went on and on and on with reasons she should stay in the field. But you know what? I didn't want her to leave. I just wanted to see her there the next day and the day after that and the next week after that. When I go back and I read the written account of what I said, it's a little embarrassing. Because 7 different ways, 7 different times in that one statement, I said to her, stay here, stay here, stay here, stay here, stay here, stay here, stay here. Well, she did something I'd never seen anyone do before. She bowed with this flourishing bow low to the ground, her face almost touching the ground, and then she got back up and she said, you're being so kind to me, even though I'm a foreigner. When I heard that word, foreigner, I understood so much. I understood she knew who she was. Maybe more importantly, she knew who she wasn't. I resolved in that moment never to say anything like that to her. Never to characterize her as a foreigner or a Moabite. Never to talk about her origins. It wasn't necessary. There was nothing to be gained from it, and I wanted to see her day after day in that field. Day after day I did see her, gathering barley. At lunchtime that first day, I called her over to my table and I said, come and get some bread dipped in vinegar. Now I realize in your day and time that may not sound very appetizing, but in my time that was something that the supervisors got to enjoy. We also had roasted grain that was really more fit to eat. And I said, here, come, have some roasted grain. And when she finished, there was lots of the grain left that I'd given her. I gave her a sack, a cloth satchel to take it with her in. When she went back to the field, I called the men over to me. And I said to them, listen, don't harass her, leave her alone. Don't run her off. Let her gather as much as she's able to gather. In fact, I said to them, I want you to accidentally drop whole heads of grain where she's gleaning. I don't want her to have to pick up only the little individual pieces of grain. I want her to be able to pick up heads of grain like what you're gathering. Well, the men smiled at me. I almost thought I saw them roll their eyes a little bit, but they didn't say anything. And they went ahead and did exactly as I'd asked them to do. At the end of the day, I noticed Ruth had quite the large pile of grain that she gathered up, and she left. And like I said, I did see her every day, and I so look forward to seeing her every day after that. After the barley season, it was wheat season. And she came back and she gleaned wheat in my field for a month or so. And then it was over. And I wondered to myself if I'd ever see her again. I thought maybe she'll move on or be somewhere else by the time the next gleaning season comes up. I had no idea. I hoped I would. My heart yearned to see her again, just in a parental, protective sort of way. I loved the woman as a father might love his daughter. Anyway, I didn't see her again for a little while. It came time to thresh and then winnow the grain. Threshing is a process by which the grain is handled physically, kind of in a rough manner to separate the husk from the kernel of grain inside. And then winnowing is where you toss it up in the air and you let the breeze blow the chaff away and the grain falls directly to the ground. The more you do that, the more pure grain you end up with. And all of us would go and thresh our grain and winnow the grain at the same time, because when there was a breeze, and that's when you needed to do it. Winnowing was generally done up on a hill because the wind would sort of gather up there. It would blow in from the valley and come up the hill, and it would pick up speed as it came up to the hill. So we would take shovels of grain and throw them up in the air, and you could see the chaff blow away. After we'd finished, there was a number of us up there that night, finished winnowing our grain. We had a meal together. Those were some really good men up there. We enjoyed each other's company. We shared stories and some good laughs. And we had a glass or two of wine to drink. I may have had more than 2 glasses, or I may not. I don't really remember. What I can tell you is I felt a little woozy, and I was very cheered up by the camaraderie and the fellowship, and maybe a glass of wine or 2. I decided it was time to call it a night, and I went to the far pile of grain that I'd been winnowing, and I curled up and went to sleep. I made sure that my cloak was over my legs because it was going to be chilly that night. In the middle of the night, I woke up and I felt cold. Something startled me, and I realized my cloak wasn't over my legs anymore. And as I reached down to pull it over, there was a person there. I was shocked. That just didn't happen up there. I said, who are you? I heard a familiar, beautiful voice. She said, I'm Ruth. I'm your servant. Cover my legs with your garment. Now that may not mean anything to you, but what that meant, what she was saying to me was, marry me. Marry me. Me? Ruth was asking me to marry her, an old man? My heart leapt at the thought of it. I can't tell you how I felt about it. Being chosen by this woman, who I'd really come to dearly love. Being asked by her to marry her. My mind raced with how all this looked. In fact, she had said to me, you're a guardian of the family interest. You're a redeemer. Basically, she was saying, you have an obligation to marry me. But it was clear her heart was all in. I'd never felt so honored in my entire life. So I processed all these thoughts, and I said to her, this is even greater an act of devotion than what you showed to your mother-in-law, Naomi, because you could have asked a younger man, rich or poor, to marry you. In essence, what I was saying, anybody would want to marry you. But you've asked me. You've really honored me with your request. As I thought about it, I realized, yes, I was a redeemer, but in the order of things, the way our law works, I was in second place. There was another man ahead of me who had a priority, had sort of the first option, if you will. So she looked, when I told her, yes, I'll do everything you've asked me to do, she looked so happy. And then I said to her, but there's another man who's higher up in the chain. He's a notch above me, and he has the first right to marry you. In the morning, I'll go and talk to him. And if he wants to marry you, then so be it. If not, I will definitely marry you. Well, I can't describe the look on her face. It went from being so happy to being crestfallen and disappointed. But she didn't say anything about that. All she said was, may it be as you said. We went to sleep. She curled up. I can tell you nothing untoward happened on the threshing floor that night. It wasn't about that for us. In the middle of the night, though, in the wee hours of the morning, I woke up again and I thought to myself, she's got to get out of here before anyone sees us and misinterprets what's happening. So I woke her up. I said, take this grain. It was a lot of grain. I said, take this grain home with you and I will handle the matter today. So she left and I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept thinking to myself, how can I put this together so that I end up getting the girl? How can I do this? Well, the next morning, I went into the city square. I was well known there, and there were 10 other men like me there, men of some stature and standing in the community. They all stood up when I came into their presence in the square. And then there he was. I really didn't know this other guy very well. I certainly knew of him. I recognized him. But I said to him, hey, buddy. Hey, friend. It was the kind of word you'd use for someone you just met. Maybe if you got a donut here at church, you might say, thanks, pal, even though you didn't know the person that gave you the donut. That was the way we communicated, because we really didn't know each other. I said, hey, buddy, come here. And I asked the other 10 men who were elders of the city to gather around. And so they all paid attention. And this is, you have to understand, we didn't have a county clerk's office like you have today. This is how real estate transactions were recorded. They were recorded in front of a whole bunch of witnesses. So I had my witnesses, I had the city fathers, the elders of the town, and I had the other man. And I said, Naomi, who's returned from Moab, needs to sell a piece of land. It should stay in the family, it should stay amongst our people, but she needs to sell this piece of land, and you're first in line. So let me know if you'd like to redeem the piece of land, and it's yours. And tell us all in the presence of these witnesses if you want to do that, because if you don't want to redeem it, I want to redeem it, and I'm second in line. Now, I had thought for a while about how to set this up. I knew he would take the piece of land. It was a nice, decent piece of land. So he said, yes, I'll take the piece of land. I knew this was the way 100 transactions happened in the city square. The offer was made and the acceptance was there, and you had, in essence, a contract, and the deal was done. That was routine. Then I unfolded the rest of my plan. The rest of my plan was to say, by the way, you might say, there's some fine print, or there may be a couple strings attached. But I said, by the way, with the land, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabite. Now remember, I had resolved in an instant when I first met this woman, never to say foreigner or Moabite in her presence, and I never did. But with this guy, friend, buddy, I said, you must acquire Ruth the Moabite, a widow who is of childbearing age, so that the family name can be preserved. She is part of the deal with the land. Well, the look on his face went from done deal to no can do. And he said, I can't take it then, because that would endanger my own inheritance. I'm not exactly sure what he meant by that, but I think he meant that he had more holdings than that piece of land, and he wasn't willing to dilute the inheritance for his other children that he already had. But we didn't really get into any of that. I wasn't interested. I just wanted to seal the deal that I could take this woman to be my wife. So I said to him, in the presence of everybody here, you're saying you cannot take the land and you won't redeem the widow. He said, that's right, I would endanger my own inheritance. So as was customary then, a sandal was removed, it was exchanged. That was the way people mentally earmarked that, yes, we saw this transaction and it's finished. Everybody saw it, and the women exclaimed, may Naomi be blessed the way Leah and Rachel were blessed to bear children that became many of the 12 tribes of Israel. So, Ruth and I were married. We did consummate our marriage after that, and she conceived a son. Our son's name was Obed. Obed later got married and became the father of Jesse. Jesse became the father of many sons, the youngest of whom, the runt of the litter, but the most spirited one, was David. He became King David, and David, of course, it was his descendants that produced our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So imagine, I end up in the genealogy of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and so does my Moabite, foreign, non-Hebrew wife, Ruth, the most beautiful woman I ever laid my eyes on. There's one thing I want to tell you that I'm really happy as I look back on this whole situation. I'm very, very happy about the way I handled one piece of this. And that was, I learned that sometimes saying less is really more. And the minute I heard that woman say, I'm a foreigner, I resolved to myself, she's never going to hear that word from me, and she's never going to hear the words Moab or Moabite from me. In that moment, I guarded my tongue from then on and just didn't say something that might have seemed obvious otherwise. I do think there's a lesson for lots of us in just knowing what not to say. It's important oftentimes to know what to say. It may be more important often to know what not to say. And that's the one thing I would like to leave you with this morning, other than how happy I am to have been Ruth's husband, David's great-grandfather, and ultimately, great later, Jesus Christ being one of our descendants. Thank you very much for having me this morning.
Amen.